People are already entering. I love to see it. So we're just going to kind of hang out here for a minute. Before, when we were in the green room beforehand, we were talking about cold weather and how you like the cold weather.
I love the cold weather. I'm in Ottawa, Canada, so it's peak winter right now, and I was pretty sad because around New Year's all the snow went away. We had a blizzard and then a rainstorm and no more snow, and I love cross-country skiing and downhill skiing, and I'm looking out the window right now and I can see a little bit of snow starting to fall. So I'm hoping that it builds back up enough of a base that I can get back out there before the winter is over.
Isn't that funny? Because I think people who haven't maybe grown up in those kinds of weather season might think, oh, you hate the snow or you don't like it. But I grew up in Michigan and spent a number of years in Colorado. I love the snow. And I love this season. It's cozy season, lots of sweaters, lots of layers, soups. And then just, I don't know, there's something about the magic of like when it's just snowing. It's so magical.
It is. I guess it must be different for people who move to somewhere snowy as adults, because I feel like we got this experience as kids where we got to build
Yep.
snow forts and snowmen and like go tobogganing and do all that stuff. So
snow angels.
yeah. So I have this like very positive association with snow and winter and cold, and I love it.
Me too. I even remember we were like at like our house was like at a T, and the snow plows would always leave this island of like snow and ice, and cars would always get stuck on it. And I even have a positive associations of pushing cars off. We would come put on our boots, push the next car off the snow island in front of our house, and it was a fun memory. So I love that we both have that. I mean, growing up in Michigan, not too dissimilar to Canada, although parts of Canada get far more snow than we do.
Yeah. I'm going out to Banff in a month for the first time to Alberta to see the Rockies and go skiing there. And that's going to feel like a complete winter wonderland with the mountains and huge amounts of snow and big skating rinks. So I'm excited for that. It'll be
yeah. That'll be fun. I'm in New York. We've not had a lick of snow. I think we had a flurry for like 30 minutes, and I was willing it into like a, really big downpour, and it didn't happen. So we've had rain, and I'm terribly disappointed right now that we haven't had much snow. I guess perhaps to your point, people who grew up in snow understand my disappointment. All right, looks like we've got a steady group of folks. We are not here to talk about weather and snow, I promise. So why don't we get started? Thank you for joining and welcome to LeadDev Bookmarked. LeadDev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club that takes place on the first Tuesday of every month. Our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome LeadDev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'm the moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of Scaling Startup, a leadership consultant and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Suzan Bond. Today we'll be talking about remote engineering management. If you have questions for Alexandra, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'll be sure to get to them later in the conversation. Alexandra Sunderland is a senior engineering manager at Fellow App, a platform where teams gather to build collaborative meeting agendas, record decisions, and keep each other accountable. Alexandra has been working as an engineer for the last decade and regularly publishes articles and speaks internationally about tech and teams, all while designing and sewing clothes that incorporate custom 3D printed elements. Welcome to the show. That's very cool, by the way. I'm like, ooh, I want to see those. Okay, so what made you write this book?
So I've been working remotely for a very, very long time. Well, the last 10 years of my career, basically. And I was at the start of the pandemic, my partner was telling me that I have all of this knowledge of how to work remotely. Everyone's getting into it for the first time, and I should write a book, and I should just put down my thoughts and kind of help people through this. And I, at the time, thought like, no, not going to do that. Writing a book is way too much work. That's not for me. But then at the end of not last year, whatever. We just started 2023. So at the end of 2021, my friend was doing this NaNoWriMo challenge, and it's the National Novel Writing Month, something like that, where you're supposed to write 50,000 words in a month so that you work towards a book. And she was asking friends if they'd want to do this with her. And I'm the only friend who decided that that sounds like fun, which is a very weird idea of fun, because 50,000 words in a month ends up being about 1,700 words a day, which is like a long blog post every single day. And I decided I'll do this because I have this idea for a book about remote management in general. And so I sat down and I halfway through the month had something that felt pretty real and wasn't just like a draft of an idea that I was going to throw away. And so I started contacting publishers, and somebody actually said like, yes, we'll publish this. And I continued on and ended up writing this book. But the main thing I want to do is just help people understand how to do remote management really well. So I think, especially at the start of everything, people were starting to get into the hang of it. They were kind of adapting the ways of managing and working into a remote environment, but they weren't quite thriving yet. And there were so many little tips and tricks I learned over such a long period of time that I wanted to surface to help people like really embrace the hard parts of remote work and really make it be something that people are great at.
I love that. I think we've had somebody else who wrote a book using NaNoWriMo. I can't remember who, but I think we
it was
have.
Camille Fournier.
Yeah, at least one. I'm almost certain at least one, if not more. Which is, it's such a great. It's a really great way to do a book, even if it's like pretty intense from what I've heard. As you said, a long blog post every day is a lot.
I mean, especially like when you're working at the same time, I'd do my work day, have dinner, and then sit at my laptop for another 5 or 6 hours just to, and I might spend like the first 4 hours just like thinking about, I need to write, and like browsing the internet. And then the last hour before bed, just writing, but it's a commitment.
Well, and just to be clear for people who are not familiar with this concept, did you do any editing of the book while you were during NaNoWriMo during that November month?
No, not at all.
Right, that's what I thought.
Yeah, like when I was reading back the book after, when I had something I thought I was happy with, and then I read it again and I saw some like way too many dad jokes, and just like I would put in brackets ha ha if I wrote a joke.
The brackets are a note to myself too. When I put in brackets, I'm like, move. Where does this go? Like, it's my like, pay attention to this because you have something funny going on here. And then last quick question. Did you have a outline? Did you know what you wanted to write before you started writing the book, or were you just sort of letting it pour out of you?
I did have a bit of an outline. I knew in general that I wanted to talk about things in order of, I want to kind of follow the arc of someone's journey at a company. So that's why I start with hiring, and then onboarding, and then meetings, and it ends with like letting people go. And it follows that kind of curve of someone's job. So I knew the main points that I wanted to hit. There's some things I decided not to talk about in the end, and some more things where I think I was going to talk about one-on-ones in my chapter about meetings, and then decided one-on-ones is just way too big of a topic on its own. So I split that one out. But yeah, I definitely had a bit of a plan going into it so that I wouldn't be all over the place, because that makes writing a lot harder.
Great. Yeah, just for those folks who are thinking about writing or interested, I always love to hear the background. So one of the things that you talk about in the book is what you call a remote work mindset. Can you tell us what that is for people who have not read the book?
Yeah, so a remote work mindset is making sure that you're working in a way that is specifically going to be good with remote work. So you can't just take the practices that you were doing in the office and copy them when you're working remotely. Like you can't, for example, I keep hearing that people say management is harder when you're working remotely because you can't just walk by someone's desk and see what they're doing. I think that that's a really weird way of like managing in person anyway. I don't get it. I don't see how people ever did that as a real thing. But that's the kind of thing that you can't replicate in a remote world, because you'd be messaging people on Slack or wherever every 5 minutes saying, what are you working on? And that's not going to be sustainable. That's going to disrupt their focus all the time. And so you have to come up with new ways of embracing the fact that people aren't actually all sitting in an office together. And that means a lot of setting up new asynchronous processes and getting rid of a lot of meetings, and just being very intentional about using the benefits of remote work to your advantage.
That's great. That's a great description of that. So you talk about what you've learned in holding longer meetings, like retros, and in a remote environment. I'm wondering if you can talk about the process you use now.
Yeah. So I have this talk that came out that I did at LeadDev London last year. And I think as of 10 days ago, it's not behind a paywall anymore. So you can go to the website and check it out, where I talk specifically about retrospectives, which is one of the longest types of meetings that I used to have. So when I was working remotely, I was also kind of in a hybrid role where I was working out of Toronto for a company in Ottawa that was the whole office was based in Ottawa, and I was the one person working remote. And I would travel every so often to Ottawa to have in-person meetings with people. And one of the things I did was this retro, which was a 4-hour long meeting. And that is a ridiculously long meeting to have even in person, but it was kind of like a workshop. It was fun. We'd have like all these Post-it notes we'd put up on the wall, and stickers, and kind of make an afternoon of it. And when everybody else went remote, I, for some reason, decided, going back to what I was just saying about how you can't copy remote or hybrid, you can't copy in-person processes to remote. I decided to hold this 4-hour meeting remotely, and I made everyone sit at their computer from home, like early 2020, and go through all the same steps that we were doing in person, but on their computer. And we had maybe like a little break in the middle to grab water, but that was it. And the feedback from that was awful. Like, people liked what came out of the meeting, but did not like being on the call for so long. And because of that, I started thinking about like, how can we make these longer types of meetings better? And my main point is that I think that like you should have as few meetings as possible. And when they do happen, they should be very short with a tight agenda. But for this particular type of meeting, because retros are kind of hard to fit into smaller time slots, what I put a lot of emphasis on is running them half asynchronously. And so what that means is we have an agenda in our notes, and we have a very clear outline of what is expected for people to do before that meeting starts, because we want the synchronous time that we spend together should be spent as wisely as possible. And so we have all these steps that people have to do before we actually sit on the call together. And for the retro, that means people have to come up with their ideas. So like the virtual Post-it notes beforehand, have to read through what other people have written, comment on things, vote on things, all of those steps that don't really have to happen on the call. Like, there's no real need for us to sit in silence for 15 minutes thinking. That all happens beforehand, so that when we get on the call, we just have the discussions about the most important things. And so that works for retros, but basically any other type of meeting as well, where the more work you put into creating an agenda and putting forth like the information that needs to be shared and deciding on exactly what needs to be talked about and what needs to be cited, that means that people get to spend all the prep time beforehand, before the meeting, on their own, thinking about it on their own time. And that means that the discussions that we end up having during meetings are just so much more productive and thoughtful, because you're not finding out information at the same time as everyone and having to come up with an answer on the spot.
That's so great. Well, so we've covered, longer retros and then just regular meetings. But then I want to cover another particular kind of one, which is one-on-ones, right? That's a very particular kind of meeting. And, I think you say that remote one-on-ones are better than in-person ones. And I think this might be counterintuitive to some people. So I would just love if you could sort of share your thoughts and what you think the benefits are.
Yeah. So in the last few months, I've actually started to go to an office, which is very exciting for me because it's like the first time I get to work in person. And so I'm doubling down almost in how I feel about this because I've been doing a lot of in-person one-on-ones recently. And what I've noticed about the strangeness of in-person one-on-ones is that we sit in the same area and we get up at the same time and walk to a meeting room where like everybody can see us. You don't know how thick the walls are. Everyone can probably hear what you're saying. You're super aware of how you're sitting. You have to maintain eye contact. And it's very difficult to know, like, what do you do? Do you bring a laptop? Is that appropriate? Like, I love having my laptops for one-on-ones as well, because it's so important to take notes and have an agenda. And so, but it's weird having a laptop in front of someone and writing when they're talking to you about something personal. So I find like this whole in-person thing is interesting. But why I like remote ones so much is because there's just this comfort level that you have when you're in your own environment. Like I'm in my room right now at home, and I know that I don't have to maintain eye contact with you. I can look over there, and that feels like a little bit easier. And that can make certain difficult conversations easier to have. And I find it similar to the whole notion of when you're like sitting on a park bench, driving in a car with someone, like sitting somewhere facing the same direction, you tend to have more deep conversations and it's easier to talk about the tough things. You kind of get that same feeling when you're doing a one-on-one remotely too, when you're on a video call, because you're not sitting directly in front of that person. So there's that. And then also they're more private. Like I definitely love being able to not have to whisper right now because maybe coworkers will hear what I'm saying. Like that makes it easier to have those tougher discussions. And then as a manager specifically too, something I really appreciate sometimes is the benefit you get of privacy from emotions. So sometimes, in one-on-ones, bad news is shared with you and maybe something awful is going on in someone's life. And you as a manager probably, or I sometimes like feel very sad after those one-on-ones. And if I was in an office, if I walk out of that meeting and I look very visibly sad, that's probably not great because it's private information and you don't want other people knowing that something bad was shared. And so I appreciate being here where I don't have to like put as much effort to mask that emotion and I can just deal with it and continue on with my day. So yeah, so many reasons why just like that privacy and all of that makes one-on-ones really great and I find more comfortable.
Yeah, I think some people would be surprised that you can have real conversations because that privacy, like the more deep real conversations, even if it's just not hard conversations, maybe we could if we feel more comfortable, we can say something, reveal something sooner. So we don't get to the hard conversation because maybe I'm struggling and I'm afraid to tell you I'm in the middle of the office because I don't want to cry and all of those things. And because we are sending unintended messages perhaps to the rest of the office.
Yeah. I feel like I've when I was talking with my old manager before, like I probably chickened out so many times in trying to share hard news because like I would have it in my mind, I'm gonna say this. And then we get there in person and be like, ooh, this actually feels uncomfortable. I don't feel right saying it. But virtually I share probably way too much.
Well, it's like the idea of psychological safety. And we talk a lot about psychological safety. And what I love in the book is how you basically draw a line between how remote one-on-ones can actually provide more psychological safety for the really productive conversations to happen. So love that. So there's this idea, continuing on one-on-ones, there's this idea that one-on-ones are only for direct reports, that basically the manager shouldn't have an agenda or talk too much. I mean, I hear that this comes up in my leadership workshops. We literally had a conversation about this in my most recent one. The group had a conversation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about who are one-on-ones for and who should be putting things on the agenda.
I love this topic, and it's kind of heartbreaking, I find too, because so often online and in books, like everywhere I see that it's the direct reports meeting, they have to make the agenda, they run the show, it's their whole thing. And I love that the advice is putting the emphasis on the fact that they should prepare and that it is ultimately a benefit for them to have these meetings. But I feel kind of weird about it as well, because I find when people are giving that advice, it places this weird importance on the manager and kind of makes it seem like they're this beacon of knowledge and you should be lucky to meet with them. Therefore, you should come prepared with all this stuff to ask them. And I find that that's a very weird dynamic, like having the manager be so important that's the case. So I think that the one-on-ones between managers and their team are, like, they should be prepared equally by both parties, because it is as much for the report as it is for the manager. Because they're not just meetings to get feedback about your work and ask questions about how to do specific things. Like, they're so important for building relationships between people, which makes everything about work so much easier. They're all about like I love having one-on-ones with people because it gives me the chance to ask them a lot of open-ended questions about how they think about certain business things, what they want to see on the team, how they think certain initiatives are going. And it's so important to have a space where you can collect information like that from people, because their opinions really matter and probably are also very different than what your opinions on the matter are. And it makes them feel heard as well. Like having your manager ask you questions about what you think about certain things, it's great at getting people to start thinking about that on their own more and more. But it also makes you feel like your opinion is valuable and you're feeling heard and you're more a part of the team. So I love using one-on-ones for those kinds of discussions. And I think that any like one-on-one meeting agenda should have like at least one talking point from the manager every time too, because it's so important that they're contributing equally.
Well, yeah, and I know we agree on this. I'm not someone who thinks it's only for them, because my opinion is one-on-one is about relation, as you kind of pointed to. It's about your partnership and building a relationship. It's about a conversation. And I think it can also maybe lead to, if a manager doesn't feel like they can say something, I think it can almost, if it's only about them, then it can lead them to maybe hold back on important information. And that can lead to a longer feedback cycle that turns not great. And I'm sure you've seen it. I've seen a lot of that in my work, so it's really great how you talk about it as a relationship and a partnership and a conversation. It's not just a one-way street.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not some hierarchical meeting just cause for you to get information. Like managers have to work so closely with the people on their team. And I agree completely.
Right? It's an information flow, but it's also, you're continuing to build your relationship. You're always building your relationship. So I love that you talked about that, because that's something that I tend to agree with. I have a similar opinion, though, to be clear, I absolutely want to empower the direct reports, and like that's really important that they have the time to have their say, for sure. So shared agenda is like a fantastic way to do that. Okay, so one more thing on this whole one-on-one thing. I think it's really important. People are really curious. What are a couple things managers can do to make sure a remote one-on-one is successful, outside of what we've already talked about, maybe?
Yeah. So I think we just so slightly touched on how agendas are important, and shared agendas are, I think, especially in remote work, also very important to have, so that you're you know that there's stuff that you're going to talk about. You can start thinking about what the other person has put down ahead of time, so you come more prepared. But also it's useful for taking notes during the call, so that If somebody tells me that they're really interested in learning about some specific thing, or they have this feedback, I'll write that down because I have a very bad memory, but I'll write it down because it is useful. And then if they see what I wrote and they know, and they realize that I misunderstood what they were saying, that's an opportunity to immediately correct that instead of finding out later down the road when like some bad decision has been made because I misunderstood what was going on. So that is terrific already at making one-on-ones better. And then I also don't think that you have to have an agenda every single time, which is also an opinion.
That's great. I was wondering about that. That's great. Okay, tell us more.
Yeah, I think like they're great. And I love agendas. Most meetings in general, yes, they should have agendas. But for one-on-ones, sometimes there just isn't anything that needs to be talked about the business. Like I love having time for just social chatting. And no matter what, all of my one-on-ones always start with like a few minutes of catching up and talking about life and whatever people want to share. But sometimes it's just talking about like skiing the whole time, or sometimes we'll meet up in person and go for a coffee and talk about their dog. And that's perfectly fine. Like there is nothing wrong with just spending a whole one-on-one talking about whatever it is, or it could be business stuff too, that just like happens to come up naturally. But I think that there's space for these conversations to happen in an unstructured manner too. And it's important to see where that leads, and it builds up that relationship. So, I mean, they can't all be like that, but definitely there should be space for some of that. And then, I mean, some of the other tips I have for one-on-ones too, what I've really tried to do this year as well is I'm trying to organize my schedule so that people get as much focus time as possible. So this is very top of mind, but making sure that one-on-ones don't disrupt your team's big blocks of focus time. And so I rearranged my schedule because I think there were some meetings where like people on my team would have 4 hours in the afternoon with no meetings other than our one-on-one, which broke up their entire afternoon and meant that they have that on their mind and they can't just spend the whole 4 hours writing code or doing whatever it is they'd like to do. So making sure that like the meetings are conveniently timed for them, but also maybe next to other meetings or around lunch so that they get more focus time back. Yeah. So those are some of my top tips.
I love it. You didn't say this out loud, but I think there are people who would think, oh, if we have nothing to talk about, we should just cancel our one-on-one. And what I hear is like, you didn't say this, but I make up that you would say, no, don't cancel your one-on-one.
Yeah, no, I think like there are reasons to cancel one-on-ones. Like if someone's on vacation or you're like really, really, really heads down in like an outage or something like that, like sure, you can cancel the one-on-one then. But if the reason is just that you have nothing to talk about, then I think that you should probably meet anyway. If it's okay to just end early, if really the conversation is going nowhere. And if it happens super often as well, then maybe the issue is that you're meeting too frequently. So you can go from like a weekly cadence to a bi-weekly cadence, and then you'll have 2 weeks worth of things to talk about at a time. One-on-one should always be recurring as well. It turns out that's not something that's well known throughout the industry, but some people schedule one-on-ones as like one-offs as they happen, which is
that's too much scheduling for me. Like that's a lot of brain. I'm like, that's too much brain power. Like you're spending too much time. For me, I would spend way too much time thinking about how to schedule that in.
Yeah, it's so much effort.
And then I think also like, are we doing, and there people like also like to know, sorry to interrupt you, consistency. We know we're meeting again. So if I have an issue, I know we got this thing coming up on Tuesday. I can talk about it then, and that can make me relax. I can make a note to myself.
Yeah, exactly. Like I love having meeting notes for that, because I'll think of something I want to chat with someone on my team about, and instead of messaging them right away in Slack and breaking their flow and getting them to talk with me now, I'll just throw it on the agenda so that when we have that meeting eventually, we talk about it, and then it's a good use of everyone's time. But yeah, so recurring meetings have to be set up for one-on-ones. It's step number one in making sure they go well.
Love that. So I want to go to a different topic. So camera off or camera on is such a big discussion for folks in remote situations. I mean, full disclosure, I coach with camera off. But I have lots of meetings with camera on. And there's lots of like nuance and good reasons on both sides of the debate. I'm just wondering if you can give some thoughts on your opinion about it and how folks might navigate this, because there are genuine opinions on both sides,
Yeah.
like
And
valid.
yeah, definitely valid opinions on both sides. And I think that no matter what, it is okay to have an opinion, and nobody's opinion about what they prefer is wrong. But I think what is wrong is having a mandate that people need to always have their camera on. And I can understand that people, the most common thing I hear is that it's easier to see body language and understand emotion when you can see someone. And that may be true. I don't think there are that many work conversations where like that level of detail and information is necessary to the conversation. But what I think that it's not right to enforce camera on all the time, because you don't have the right to look at someone in the privacy of their own home and watch them on the screen. Like it's already such an invasion of privacy when you're getting to see this like look into someone's home and see them working there. So enforcing that is so strange. And there's so many reasons why someone might want to have their camera off, because maybe maybe their internet quality isn't great that day, or they're having a bad hair day, or they just had a very emotional one-on-one, which is one of the reasons I have my camera off sometimes, or they have kids in the background, like whatever it is. You don't have the right to know what that reason is all the time, and then also to enforce that they turn it on anyway. So that's my big thing. Like I'm never gonna complain that people like ask for people to turn it on if they can. That's fine. But I always respect people's decisions to not have that on. And there's so many situations too, I find, where having camera off is so much better. And this is probably similar with the coaching situation too. Like that's something where you have to do a lot of thought. And so things like that, or if there's an outage you're investigating, or a brainstorming meeting, or anything like that, where you need to really use your like focus power as much as possible. I find it easier to have camera off, because when camera's on, you're very aware of how you look. And
Right. Like,
yeah.
how's my, I always like try, I'm always, like, as I tell people, I'm like, I don't want to worry about arranging my face when I'm trying to coach you. And sometimes I pace and I'm like, that's very distracting when your coach is walking back and forth in front of a screen. Right. It is. It's like there's a lot of energy that goes towards that.
Yeah. And like debugging calls and stuff too. Like I love using, we use like Slack huddles and Discord and things like that for pair programming and stuff, which I love instead of video calls. Cause like my default stance for thinking about code is like, like slouched back in my chair, like looking like a mess.
Eyes barely in the screen.
Yeah. And that's just how I think better. And I don't want to be worried about what people think of me when I'm doing that. So there's so many reasons why camera off is better. And yeah, I don't think that anyone should be enforcing camera on for people.
Yeah. And I think there are times, I mean, my husband loves camera on at times because he reads lips because he's hard of hearing, and people, who are maybe, need to read lips or for other reasons. But I love the idea of like, it shouldn't always be mandated. And that's, a mandate for, I think when we say always or never, I think that's always tricky anyway. Yeah. But I love that you weighed in on this debate and sort of thinking about the situations. Like for me personally, I coach with the camera off, but almost every other meeting I have the camera on, almost always, because I love to see people. I want to build a relationship with you, but if someone says, can we do camera off? I'm just not feeling it today. Yep. Or my internet's terrible. Yep. No problem. So I love that, like, flexibility. So I'm in a blend. I have a couple questions left, but we're getting a bunch of questions, and there's a bunch of questions around one topic, which is burnout. And so, everyone's susceptible to it. And so, I think I'm going to start with my question, and we're going to take a question from the audience around this. So what are some ways that managers can prevent burnout?
So it's a very hard thing to do. And I think there are two things that they're more tactical that come to mind, like other than the normal, like turn off notifications and take a step away and go on a walk during the day and all that stuff. But the first thing that I do, so like last year was I didn't burn out, but I was definitely like on edge because I was writing the book. I had 3 conferences, I had all these podcasts, like I was really, really feeling it. And that was all on top of my job. And I at times just felt like I had absolutely no energy left and was kind of at my limit and was worried about going too far and burning out. And so the first thing I did was let my team know and tell them, like, not upfront, like, this is the grand scheme of things and I feel this way, but specifically, like, I'm going to take a step back from this meeting because I have all these things going on and I'm feeling really stressed right now, or saying, I need someone to take on this because I feel like I can't and it's making me stressed, and really emphasizing that it's like my mental health and I need to cool it and look out for myself. And I was like very open and honest about that and got a lot of positive feedback from people, and lots of people messaging me privately saying, like, thank you so much for sharing. Like, uh, that makes us feel like we can share things like that too, which was so nice to see. And I hadn't realized that it would have that kind of impact at first, but it made it so that they knew what was going on for me. And so I felt more okay about, like, I wasn't dropping the ball per se, but I felt like they understand what I'm going through and so are going to be more supportive. And then they started doing similar things too, which made me feel really great that they were being open and upfront about it instead of pushing themselves too hard and burning out. So that was the first thing I did. And then the second thing I've started to do a little bit more is being more conscious about taking little vacations throughout the year. And this is a pretty cultural thing, because I know that some countries you have to take like vacation time, like 2 weeks at a time, and you don't really get the chance to take like a day off here and there. And they're also, like, in Canada, we don't get nearly as much vacation time as people in Europe do. But what I've been doing, I had a really bad habit for a while of just waiting till the end of the year and then scrambling, remembering I have this time to use up. And so instead, I've been more conscious at scheduling like even half days throughout the year and just saying, like, I'm going to take this half day off here and like go for a walk in the park and do this stuff outside of work where I don't have to think about it. And the nice thing about that is that it's easier to schedule, especially as a manager. It's easier to schedule 1 or half days off than it is a full week, because typically you don't have to like find someone to take on responsibilities and like set up a person, like a point person for the team when you're gone. Like, there are just these things you have to do as a manager when you take a lot of time off at once, and you don't have to do that for a day at a time. So it's easier to do that, to like build in these breaks so that you get some time away from your computer. So yeah, those are the 2 things that have been like helping me recover.
That's great. No, it's really good. And on that note, to the other side of that, I'm going to take an audience question. I've found that it's very hard to spot burnout in employees in a full remote situation. What's your advice for spotting it in your team?
Yeah, that's very tricky too. And part of I mean, part of I guess part of that is because I was so honest about how I was feeling, people have started to be even more open and honest with me as well about that. So number one thing there is like create as much as you can that culture of like psychological safety, so people feel comfortable mentioning it on their own when they're starting to feel it. But also, it's a great thing to use one-on-ones for, to just every so often ask, like, how are you really doing? And like, what is your workload like? What are you looking forward to? And I find, because I ask those types of questions at a pretty regular cadence, whenever answers kind of start to veer from normal, and maybe people aren't that excited for the next few months, maybe a little bit more pessimistic. Maybe they're taking on a little bit too much work, like because you have those regular checkpoints. And I know what people normally say, it starts to give indications as to whether people are kind of veering towards that. And you don't want to start that conversation of like, hey, you burnt out, when they've like hit a wall.
Right.
It's good to like, whenever there's too much going on, we'll have a conversation about like, is there something we could be doing differently, reinforcing that people have to take their vacation, and like getting ahead of it and taking steps to course correct.
Well, yeah, and I love what you said because, I coach with the video off, and what that has taught me is to listen to pay attention to small cues. And it's similar in a remote environment. I think there's like these small, tiny things and patterns that you can begin to see. And it's not, oh, are they burnt out? But, oh, I think I need to check in. And again, are you burnt out? It's too confrontational, but using it as like trying to find these small ways that in pattern kind of looking at patterns like, oh wait, they're talking less, they're interacting in Slack less.
Yeah,
those might be things to pay attention to, right? They're not excited about their project because burnout can also not just be about working too much, but it's about like, I don't really like my projects, I'm not passionate about what I'm working on.
yeah. They're very, and they're hard signals to pay attention to as well. You have to put a lot of deliberate effort to really look out for it.
You do. Admittedly, to be true, to be fair, I've been coaching a long time. You have to put energy into it for sure. It puts a little bit more extra effort. So I'm going to end with one last quick question. I know we're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions. Thank you so much for these questions. I want to talk about something completely different, which is async workflows. They're even more important when it comes to a remote environment. And I'm curious if you can say a few of like maybe of your best tips for thinking about how to think about that.
Yeah. So async, just in case, and I think we mentioned it a few times, but if people aren't aware, async is specifically communication that happens not in real time. So sending videos to someone, sending messages, emails, just like not direct conversations, basically. And I think in the remote world, it's really important to default to that most of the time, like as much as possible. Because I mean, for one, there are scheduling issues for talking with people if you're in different time zones, but also part of like if you're working remote, you should make the most of it. And so that means not necessarily being at your desk 9 to 5. It could mean like I in the winter start my day later because I like going skiing and then coming home and then starting at like 11 in the morning instead, because I get that flexibility. So there are just so many reasons why synchronous communication might be more difficult to do in a remote world. And I think it's important to always default to async as well as a benefit, because it gives you more time for thoughts on all sorts of things. And so instead of like if I as an engineer, I'm going to have a conversation with the product team about how to build a specific feature, we could do that conversation in a meeting real time and kind of like hash it out together. But it would also, I think a lot of the time is more beneficial if you write down all of your thoughts, send that to them, and then, or vice versa, and then read through it and really think on it and spend a lot of time thinking through your answer before sending it back, and then letting them process and do the same thing. Because then it goes back to what I was saying about the retros, where when you have that asynchronous portion before the retro, where you have to read through people's post-it notes and think about things, you end up saving a lot of discussions that wouldn't necessarily happen because you've gotten the chance to think deeply about the topic. So it makes things more efficient overall. So yeah, so my overall though, like my biggest tips for async workflows in the remote world is try to default to them as much as possible. There's all sorts of async type of communication too. Like it's not just sending a Slack message, and sending a Slack message also comes off as like synchronous because people see that and immediately want to reply. So not really the best use of it. but I have like all sorts of different mediums I use depending on the thing that's being communicated. And so one of my favorites to do is send recorded videos of myself talking to someone. And that's especially useful, I find, if it's it could be like perceived as an emotional topic. So if I have feedback for someone that doesn't have to be discussed in real time, or I just want to like share some news about something, I'll record a video so they can see how I look. They can get the body language. There's less room for misinterpretation like there is when you're writing. Yeah, so you can send videos, you can send files, you can send emails, Slack maybe, but yeah, there's all sorts of mediums for async communication, which I try to use as much as possible, with meetings being a last resort.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just for everyone who has not read the book, it's such a great mixture of practical advice, but then some thought-provoking ideas and questions about remote work. I really encourage you to read it. Thank you for joining us for the session. Alexandra will be joining us over on the LeadDev Slack, where she will be taking some questions. So I know we have some questions that we didn't get to today. I'm really sorry about that, but she'll be over there. Head over to the Bookmarked channel where that'll be taking place. Our next session will be on February 7th, where we'll be speaking with Emma Bostian on her book, Decoding the Technical Interview Process. And we'll also actually be talking with Lima Nazari next week about her book on A/B testing. So I hope you all will join us. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks.